honored to introduce someone who's a friend of active duty military, veterans, and of course, historic preservation. He has veterans' roots that have served in the Civil War, and he's put his money where his mouth is with the American Battlefield Trust, helping to make videos and to support battlefield education and preservation. He's a country music icon, and he's a star of the small and silver screen. And he doesn't really fit on the small screen if you see the size of him. He's somebody who's worked with everyone from Snoop Dogg to Gary Edelman.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the National Anthem, performed by country music star and proud advocate for our nation's veterans, Trace Adkins.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Please welcome World War II historian, Dr. Jared Frederick.
Good evening. Thank you. I think that was the best warm-up act I will ever have. In all seriousness, special thanks to Mr. Adkins, who, in addition to being a gifted musician, is also a staunch supporter of battlefield preservation. Let's give him a round of applause for those efforts as well. My name is Dr. Jared Frederick. I'm a history professor at Penn State Altoona and host of Real History on YouTube. With both of those endeavors, I enjoy conversation on history and Hollywood, and I'll be moderating a special discussion on those topics with two uniquely qualified guests this evening. Our finale tonight is a special screening of the 2004 A&E production Ike, Countdown to D-Day, which depicts the tense 90 days leading up to the Normandy invasion and how Dwight Eisenhower, against all odds, brilliantly orchestrated one of the most important military operations in modern history. Tom Selleck embodies the title character with commanding stoicism, a sense of purpose, and the behavioral traits that defined Eisenhower, all while lacking his trademark mustache. Selleck, a non-smoker, temporarily picked up the cigarette habit since Ike, at the time of the invasion, smoked 4 packs of cigarettes per day to cope with the immense burden placed on him. The momentous decision to initiate Operation Overlord did not come lightly. During one of his frequent strolls around headquarters at Suffolk House, Eisenhower encountered NBC correspondent Red Mueller. With head lowered and hands in pockets, Eisenhower was silent as they paced the estate's gravel pathways. Ike seemed completely preoccupied with his own thoughts, completely immersed in all of his problems, Mueller recalled. The reporter wished to pose questions, but the general's thoughts were elsewhere. Ike retired to his austere headquarters trailer and appeared to be bowed down with worry, as though each of the 4 stars on either shoulder weighed a ton, as Mueller recalled. And that is the strain that is so effectively conveyed in Tom Selleck's performance as Eisenhower. Filmed in New Zealand, Ike, Countdown to D-Day, was released for Memorial Day 2004, immediately preceding the 60th anniversary of the Normandy invasion. However, the movie is not the first time Eisenhower was depicted in motion pictures. The first notable portrayal of the general was in 1962, The Longest Day. He was played by Henry Grace, a set designer at MGM Studios who bore an uncanny likeness to the Supreme Commander and who, just by walking the studio streets, was frequently mistaken for him. In more recent years, Ike was played by Robin Williams in 2013's The Butler, and Eisenhower is set to be depicted on the big screen yet again within the year. And if you don't know already, we will momentarily reveal who will be playing him. But while it may be easy for us to commemorate this 80th anniversary of VE Day in celebratory mood, we must also remember the immense cost, and that the long-term survival of democracy is not to be accepted as a foregone conclusion. When Eisenhower gazed out upon the Normandy American Cemetery in 1964, he admitted to Walter Cronkite, "I devoutly hope that we will never again have to see such scenes as these. I think and hope and pray that humanity will learn more than we had learned up until that time. But these people gave us a chance, and they bought time for us so that we can do better than we have before." The serious question then that we must ask is this: to what extent has the world squandered that second chance? Major war again rages in Europe and the Middle East. Anti-Semitism endures. Genocide persists. The greater Pacific area teeters on the brink of conflict. And in many corners of the world, democracy seems to be losing in the face of authoritarianism. What we need now, more than ever, is insight and perspective, both personal and academic. To help us in this quest, I'm honored to introduce our expert panelists this evening. Susan Eisenhower, granddaughter of Dwight Eisenhower, is well known for her work as a policy analyst. Most of her efforts focus on national security and related strategic issues. She has brought this work to light in her writings as an essayist, op-ed writer, biographer, and editor. In 1986, Susan founded the Eisenhower Group Incorporated, a Washington-based consulting company. She has appeared on countless news programs, TV specials, and documentaries. As a policy analyst, Eisenhower holds year-long seminars on strategy for competitively selected students through the Eisenhower Institute at Gettysburg College. Her Gettysburg ties are also reflected in her long association with and support of Eisenhower National Historic Site. Her wonderful books include Mrs. Ike, Memories and Reflections of the Life of Mamie Eisenhower, and Breaking Free, a memoir of love and revolution. Her most recent book is How Ike Led, The Principles Behind Eisenhower's Biggest Decisions, which is a fantastic read. Our next expert boasts a resume that is no less impressive. Dr. Craig L. Symonds is Professor History Emeritus at the United States Naval Academy, where he taught for 30 years. From 2017 to 2020, he was the Ernest J. King Professor at the U.S. Naval War College. Craig is author of 18 books, including Nimitz at War, which won the 2023 Gilder Lehrman Prize for Military History, and Neptune, about the U.S. Navy's role in the D-Day landings, which won the S.E. Morrison Prize. His most recent book is Annapolis Goes to War, analyzing the Naval Academy class of 1940. That work is released next month. Symonds has been also awarded the Lincoln Prize, the Roosevelt Prize, and the Pritzker Award for Lifetime Achievement in Military Writing. He just needs an Academy Award to top off that list, I think. And in keeping with tonight's Hollywood theme, I will also add that he gives fantastic commentary on the DVD special features of both the movie Gettysburg and Midway. Please join me in welcoming Susan Eisenhower and Dr. Craig Symonds. Thank you so much for joining us on this, the anniversary weekend commemorating VE Day. Susan, I'd like to start with you, because I think that there are probably few people on the planet who could offer such profound and personal insight on Dwight Eisenhower as you. And so the question I'd like to start off with, when and through what means did you first come to terms that your grandfather had been in charge of this momentous effort during the Second World War?
Well, Jared, thank you very much. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And I will answer that question, but I'd just like to take a moment to recognize in our audience this evening the SHAFE Veterans Association members. This is a group very dear to my heart. The fathers of this group, and still some veterans who are members, served at SHAFE headquarters during World War II, and I'm so glad you're with us this evening. I'd also like to recognize Roger Sullivan, his wife, Susan, who is not able to be with us this evening, though, is the daughter of General Andrew J. Goodpaster, who worked for both General Marshall and General Eisenhower, and President Eisenhower, and was a pivotal individual in my career. And he was full of Eisenhower stories, including the great aphorism that both George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower loved: let's not make our mistakes in a hurry. In any case, when did I first realize that my grandfather had been Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe? I'm not sure it ever came to me one day like lightning, but he did invite many of his comrades to the Gettysburg farm, and some of them came just to the White House, but I met most of them, including Monty, Bernard Law Montgomery, who was the most senior of the British military officers. Winston Churchill came to Gettysburg as well, Charles de Gaulle, and it was really, something that made you realize that there was a whole story before his presidency, which is sort of where I come in. In any case, I also, and I think this is a rather fun fact, that people who were working for him at the Eisenhower farm had been with him on D-Day. And that includes General Arthur Nevins, who, if you read Crusade in Europe, is mentioned a number of times for being with him there at Southwark House when the decision was made. His valet, Sergeant Money, was with him, along with the other valet, Mickey McKeough. And also the driver, Sergeant Dry, who actually was the person who took Ike to see the 101st Airborne Division on June 5th. He was a little bothered that he never got credit for that, I have to say. But I certainly, yeah. I think it was, the rumor had it was another driver, but no, it was Sergeant Dry, and I heard a lot about that. Let me just say one other thing. Granddad didn't have a tendency to rewind the tape. I got a a 7-year-old, maybe I was as much as 10-year-old version of the D-Day invasion at his office here in Gettysburg. He had a large map in the back room, and I asked him to tell me about it, and he gave me, you know, the third grade version. And then there was a movie called Crusade in Europe. It was a documentary. He did not watch it with us. My brother and I were in the back room at the Eisenhower farm, glued to this particular film, but Eisenhower was on the phone trying to think about the future and to solve problems.
What a history lesson, such an early point. Craig, 2 years ago, you had a really great conversation with one of the park rangers at Eisenhower National Historic Site, Dan Vermiglia, that was a contrast in study and style between Nimitz and Eisenhower, which I just found to be really fascinating. In what ways were these two men the right guys in the right place at the right time?
Oh, what a great question. How much time do we have? I think, let me preface that by saying, I think you can, in a macro sense, divide leadership temperament into two groups. There are those thoughtful, questioning, philosophical leaders who look at the big picture, and there are those who put the bit in their teeth and charge the hill. You want both of them on your side. You don't want to go into war with just one or just the other. But both Eisenhower and Nimitz belong to that first group. They were people who listened at least as much as they talked, who took the broad picture, who were not in a hurry to make mistakes, as contrasted to, just for example, the Halseys, the Pattons. I would put Bernard Law Montgomery in that group as well, who were less farsighted and more eager and needed people like Eisenhower and Nimitz to guide, control, and constrain them. So I think there's an awful lot of similarity, not just in terms of leadership style, but in terms of temperament. And temperament is one of the key elements of successful leadership. You can't fly off the handle. You can't lose your composure at any moment when lives are hanging in the balance. So, and just as an aside, by the way, they're both of German descent, which is kind of interesting. So.
Yeah. I'd like to add one thing, is that I should say very quickly that my family tried as hard as they could to compartmentalize our relationship with our grandparents and their professional lives. My father said, "Don't start wearing the boss's stars." Okay? But in doing the research from my book, I sort of summed up exactly what you're saying, which I think is such an important notion that you advanced. First of all, he was a strategic leader, but I think the essence of his brilliance is that he had an instinct about when to deploy his ego and when to suppress it. And that, in order to do that and to know when, you know, it's time to really go to battle over an issue, that has a lot to do with instinct, I think, but also a sense of the longer picture.
A central tenet of your book, How Ike Led, is character matters. So what sort of standard did Ike have for himself and those who worked under him along those lines?
Well, I would say, actually, when I started to write this book, it was going to be called something entirely different. It was going to be called Truth from Power. And the notion was that the first people Dwight Eisenhower took on when it was time to get things straightened up were his own people. He took on, you might say, his German ancestry in a way. I mean, held the Germans to a really tough account for that war. He took on his own political party. He took on his own military profession. He believed that you start with your team, but mostly the number one group or person you start with is yourself. And I think this kind of accountability was something that made both of his big enterprises in the 40s and 50s successful.
Craig, along similar lines, in your book, World War II at Sea, you note that Eisenhower, who rarely had anything negative to say about anybody, called Admiral Ernest King deliberately rude. What can you tell us about the importance of cordiality and camaraderie among the officer class in wartime?
Well, another thing that Eisenhower was accurate in terms of Ernest J. King. Ernest J. King is again one of those guys you want on your side, but on the other hand, you also have to handle him with kid gloves. He was deliberately rude and took great pride in it. He told people, "You have to be a son of a bitch. You'll never make it unless you're a son of a bitch," he would tell junior officers and middle grade officers. He was proud of it. But I didn't say that to Admiral King's face. What he did do was treat individuals who had difficult personalities in one way and other individuals who were easier to get along with in a different way. He had a sensitivity and empathy and ability to bring all the pieces together. You know, James Thomas Flexner once wrote a book about George Washington called The Indispensable Man. And I've always thought that term applies even more accurately to Eisenhower's management of the Grand Alliance. Because you think about this here, I should have brought the quotation with me. When you deal with 6 countries and 2 prime ministers and 3 presidents and 6 chiefs of staff and a dozen 4-star generals, you've got to have lots of patience. And he knew that, and he did. And it's a hard thing to do when people confront you. Montgomery in particular was difficult. Patton obviously brought problems to the table. And his ability to treat each individual in the way that was necessary to be successful broadly. But Ernest King brought additional problems besides personality, because King was an advocate of war in the Pacific. And his notion was, well, if you're not using that army over there in Europe, bring it over here and we'll beat the Japanese. And so, of course, Eisenhower had to treat that with the same calm, deliberate response that he did everything else.
And do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that's absolutely correct. I quoted Eisenhower going through the way people on his staff and elsewhere lost their tempers. And he has a very colorful way of describing King's temper. Yeah. Now, I think Ike was interested in that because as a child, he had a roaring temper himself, and his mother said of her 7 boys, he had the most to learn. I think that isn't exactly, compliment. So he was in timeout a lot as a kid, and learned to manage this in a whole variety of ways. But he did make a special note of King and how King, could lose it and get rather petty about it at the same time.
You know, King's daughter once said of him, "My father is the most even-tempered man in the Navy. Wow. He's always in a rage."
Oh, wow.
Well, I'd say that's a good segue for our next point here. As I was preparing for our conversation, I was drawn to a 1965 Reader's Digest article that Eisenhower had written, and he characterized leadership in 6 key principles, and this is what they are: selfless dedication, courageous conviction, fortitude, humility, thorough homework, power of persuasion, heart and mind, and finally, good fundamentals at every level. There is a lot that we can unpack there. But Susan, I would like to ask you, why was humility important to the general, and how did he live up to that edict in his day-to-day life?
Well, the origins of his strong feelings about humility, I might guess, came from his childhood. He came from a deeply religious childhood. I think he actually rejected, in a way, organized religion for a long time, but he was very spiritual. He didn't he was not baptized until after he was elected president for the first time, because his German-American, actually it was a subset of the Mennonite religion, did not do that, but he grew up in a very spiritual household, and part of this was you were serving something larger than yourself. I think when he got to West Point, even though he went for a free education and not necessarily, he wasn't necessarily planning to be a soldier in life, but he was taken by the idea that in the military, you are serving something bigger than yourself. And if you deeply believe that, as he did, then this means that you have to sublimate your own fears and your own desires, and you have to report for duty in every sense of the word.
If I could follow up on the humility issue, this says a lot about him and his willingness to make whatever sacrifice was necessary to hold together this fragile coalition. You know, we like to think of the special relationship between the British and the Americans as all hearts and flowers and we all get along. It wasn't necessarily true, and Ike had to make lots of compromises and deals to get it done. But one of the ones that really illustrates this a lot, I think, is they were having a staff meeting, and Montgomery was at one end of the table and Eisenhower was at the other end. And if Eisenhower often presented a calm, stoic demeanor to the troops around him, it wasn't necessarily because he was calm and stoic. He might have been roiling inside. One reason why he smoked 4 packs of unfiltered Camels every day. So they're in this meeting and Ike lights up a cigarette. Well, Montgomery, who was a fastidious non-smoker, looked up and said challengingly, "Who's smoking?" With Eisenhower in the room and a cigarette in his hands. Ike said not a word, snuffed out the cigarette, and pushed it away, put his hands in his lap. He took it.
I'm often drawn to a story that I uncovered in Stars and Stripes leading up to the Normandy invasion. And Stars and Stripes is so wonderful because it truly gives us a great snapshot of GI life in Europe. And there was a sergeant from Kansas who decided that he was going to go to SHAEF headquarters one day because he wanted to meet Eisenhower. He wanted to connect with a Kansas farm boy, much like himself. And lo and behold, he was summoned into Eisenhower's office, and they spoke for 10 minutes, and they found that they had mutual acquaintances back home. And the only thing that this enlisted man asked for was a signature because he didn't think that any of his comrades would believe his story. So in moments like that, I think we really get the sense of grandfatherly bearing that how a lot of Eisenhower's subordinates saw him.
Could I just follow up on that? This is not a very well-known story, but it's hysterical, actually, because after, while we got successfully on the beaches and made progress in Normandy, the campaign went on for quite some time. And while the attempts at a breakout were underway, Eisenhower shifted his headquarters from Shellburst, which is not that far from Bayeux, to Granville. And on the way, I'll try and keep this story short, he's in a plane accident. It's a two-seater. He had to get somewhere, and the plane that was supposed to take him couldn't do it. And then the weather got bad, and the plane crashed. Well, I think crash is too strong a word. The 2 passengers got out. He had injured now his other knee, and he hobbles up to, finally gets to the villa where he's staying. And the French locals discovered that he was in residence a couple of days later, and they sent him 2 cows. And they were called Mirabelle and Lulubelle, Ike named them. And they were out in the barn so that he could have fresh milk every day. This is an enormous kindness on the part of the French countryside. And, but then it turned out they realized that nobody knew how to milk cows. And the household staff was desperate because these animals were hurting. And so Ike gets his cane or whatever and hobbles out. He's the only one who knows how to milk a cow. So the Supreme Allied Commander's out there showing the household staff how to milk a cow.
The 4-star farmer. I love it.
Yeah,
I absolutely love it. We could go on for hours and hours with stories and lessons like these, but I'd like to shift our conversation to some discussion on our main feature tonight, and that is the movie, Ike Countdown to D-Day. Susan, how would you appraise Tom Selleck's performance in the film tonight?
Well, you know, I must say, for those who are not aware, there's going to be soon a new major motion picture with Brendan Fraser playing Dwight Eisenhower, and I think I feel the same way about Brendan Fraser as I did about Tom Selleck. Like, really? Okay. This, this will be interesting. Tom Selleck actually, of course, doesn't look like Ike, but my family and I all agreed that there were some really surprising, there was a kind of mannerism vibe there that we recognized, mostly with his hands. He had very large hands. He also had crooked little fingers, and I don't know, it just, there's something pretty authentic there. I would say that the main shortcoming of the movie is not a shortcoming of this particular movie, but when you get into a very dramatic situation, as that was at the time, the actors have to fill the watchers in on how they got to that point. So they are providing in their dialogue the context. And I think sometimes that can slow up the dialogue a little, but you gave such a wonderful introduction that I think there are going to be a lot of people in this audience who, can go with the flow when that happens.
Absolutely. Right. Have you had the chance to meet Tom Selleck and discuss?
Oh my goodness, have I ever?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, I was thinking, it is a responsibility, we'll put it that way, to carry a famous last name and do right by the person who was the person who earned acclaim. And then I thought about that, well, it might be worth it all just to be on a panel with Tom Selleck. And we had a wonderful time. I asked him how he learned some of the mannerisms, the way he used his hand, and he said that I think the shooting took about 2.5 or 3 weeks, but he had studied for this part by watching lots of newsreels. And I think that's probably how you have to do it. What did you think about did you have the same reaction I did about the context piece of it?
I mean, one of the things, I'm an historian, so I'm looking for those nitpicky little things I can pull apart and say, no, 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 no. And I've got a few of them, and we can go through some of them if you like. But I do think the film got the big thing right, which is, back to my earlier point, that Eisenhower was the central character who held together these disparate problems. I mean, remember, he's representing not just the Anglo-Americans, but the Canadians, Norwegians, the Dutch, the Belgians, and, for God's sake, the Free French, Charles de Gaulle. And then Patton comes up with the slapping the soldier and then telling the newspaper reporters that the Anglo-Americans will rule the world. He's got to deal with fires in his own backyard. And that temperament that allowed him, this movie shows him holding that together. So I think that one big thing is correct.
Yeah, I think also you're going to really enjoy some of the British actors who play their respective roles. I think the man who plays Monty is really very good. And I think you'll see not only all the difficulties of actually making these decisions, including the one that I think was very big, was the use at the end of the day of the airborne troops, because his airborne commander, Trafford Lee Mallory, Air Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, said at the last minute, pretty much just a week before D-Day, that those troops should not be used because the Germans had moved a division into the area and predicted that they would be eviscerated. 50% of the airborne troops and 70% of the glider units, which would be a catastrophe because then, if they didn't use the paratroopers, they wouldn't be able to clear the exits off of Utah Beach, or if they did use them and Trafford Lee Mallory was correct, then the entire operation could fail. I think that was one of the really tough decisions, combined with the weather forecast.
It was, and Lee Mallory, who everybody called LM, you think about this, going to the Supreme Allied Commander a week before the operation. This operation's been in planning for 16 months, and a week before it's about to be executed, he says, I don't think we can do that. I won't take the responsibility for the casualties that will ensue. You'll have to do that. And he did.
Yeah, he did, and I think that's what makes his visit with the airborne troops the night before, that very night that they took off for their uncertain fates along the Normandy coast, why that's so poignant. And it's absolutely true. I want to say you're going to see in this movie the interaction. And I love this scene in the movie with Ike talking to the paratroopers. I had the opportunity to meet later a couple of the paratroopers who were there that night, and they remember it exceedingly well. Ike was talking to them about life, about he would always try and make them feel relaxed as they could be, and sort of connected to home and life after this war. As my father explained to me, these young men were terrified. The last thing you'd want to do is go in there and give them a pep talk. Just go in them and say, we'll see you when you get home. And so that is a true story. You'll see the tall paratrooper, number 23, and he was the man who told us about that conversation. He survived the war, yeah.
That's some great insight, absolutely great. And I think, like we did last night with the execution of Private Slovik, it's also worthwhile to put this movie into some historical context. This is a film that comes out 3 years after the miniseries Band of Brothers, and I would assume it's safe to say that without the success of Band of Brothers, this film probably would not have been made. And I think for being a relatively low-budget television film, that it has a lot of technical and artistic merit to it. But Craig, if I know history movie buffs, they love the very sort of nitpicking that you addressed just a moment ago. So perhaps you could indulge us with one or two.
Well, if you insist, I will. The movie opens with a conversation between Dwight Eisenhower and Winston Churchill. Right. And the point of the conversation is the argument that the Americans generally, plural, are making that unified command is essential. You can't have a Brit in charge of the British and an American in charge of the Americans and an air marshal in charge of the Air Force and so on. You need one person at the center conducting and coordinating all the various and disparate aspects of this extraordinarily complex operation. That argument did take place. It lasted a long time. But the key discussion was not between Eisenhower and Churchill. It was between Marshall and Churchill, who went at it hammer and tong. And it's really kind of a great story because Marshall goes in there to tell him what I've just summarized, and that is you have to have one man at the center. And Churchill responds, well, what does a soldier know about driving a ship? And Marshall countered, well, what does a sailor know about driving a tank? But that's not the point. You've got to have his man at the center, and so on and so on. Well, the conversation takes place, as many of Churchill's conversations did, with him in a bed, naked, and Marshall pacing back and forth at the foot of the bed, a moving target. And at one point, Churchill, and he throws off the blanket and stalks off into the head. Now, if you can get that image out of your mind for just a moment, he comes back, thank God, with a towel and tells Marshall, all right, you win. Now, that's an important point to make about the role that Ike played. But what's bothersome about it is it shows Eisenhower being confrontational with a head of state, a head of government. And that isn't who Ike was. Ike would have not said, no, sir, you're wrong, and fought him like that. I don't think. But what the filmmakers did was collapse those to put Eisenhower on the screen early on, making the argument that Marshall made subsequently. So that's one of the things that I found a bit bothersome. Another one, and again, it's a collapsing of events. There was a terrible, I'll call it an accident, event that took place off Slapton Sands in the English Channel on the 18th of April, just prior to the invasion, where a German, what we would call PT boats, E-boats, Schnellbooten, came out and sank 3 LSTs, which was the one ship that was at the bottleneck of the whole invasion. So this was not only a disaster for the 700 men who were killed, more than were actually killed on Utah Beach in the subsequent operation, but also the loss of those 3 LSTs. Right. But they conflated that with another incident that took place off Omaha Beach when these self-propelled swimming tanks called duplex drive or DD tanks were shoved off the end of these landing craft. And because remember the weather was really bad, it was very problematical, had to be delayed a day. Because the weather was bad, they lost their integrity, and 27 out of 31 of them went to the bottom. Yeah. That was a horrible disaster. But they conflated those as if the sinking tanks had been part of the operation off Slapton Sands. They wanted to make both points, didn't have time to do them both, so they put them in the same event. So they have Churchill saying, this whole operation is dependent on some goddamn things called LSTs and Donald Ducks. Well, he did say the first part of that. LSTs were the critical bottleneck, but he never mentioned the DD tanks, the Donald Ducks. So those were some things that bothered me a bit.
And I think perhaps the biggest point of clarification that the audience should be aware of as they're watching this, the famous moment that shows Eisenhower greeting the paratroopers, the caption at the bottom of the screen says June 6th, D-Day, when in actuality it was the day before on June 5th. So don't be misled by that point
I wanted to
in the film.
mention that. That was, I think, a rather big error because they left around midnight. And I must say, for the paratroopers I met who were there that evening, they all commented to me that when they looked out of their planes, he was still on the runway. He stayed on the tarmac until the last plane had left. Just remember that he's told that 50% of those guys he said goodbye to were likely to lose their lives. And of course, the numbers weren't anything like that in the end. I think the other thing, and may Sergeant Leonard Dry rest in peace, but the wrong person drove him to the 101st Airborne Division. Yeah. But, you know, I think that's what I meant about the context, by the way, is that this collapsing is really to try and bring the audience up to the point where they will understand the rest of the film.
Sure.
But I think also I would just say, and I'm sure that, Craig, you've got many comments on this, and so do you, Jared. They show, which also happened, a pretty good array of the variety of problems he had, including one of his classmates from West Point, and we don't have to, spoiler alert, we're going to just bypass the temptation to tell you that story before you see it on the screen. But, you know, all the way down into certain kinds of personnel problems.
Yeah.
I think it only puts into sharp relief. Then the other thing they're not talking about are I think they touched on it, but the transportation plan and the lack of ammunition just before going into the launch. I mean, there were so many other things that weighed on this man significantly.
And Susan, I'd like your reaction to this, that one of the things that struck me was that background here being that one of Eisenhower's arrows in his quiver was his smile. Yeah. He deployed that smile like a weapon. One of his compatriots said it's worth 4 divisions to the Allied cause because he could either defuse a confrontation, or he could cheer up a subordinate, or he could just make people feel better. And he didn't do, Tom Selleck doesn't do much of that in this movie. We don't see that.
Not as a little more towards the end, but I think that's too bad. And I hate to say it, but his mouth probably wasn't as large. Dwight Eisenhower had literally one of the biggest smiles you've ever seen in your life.
And a great smile. If you've ever seen the photographs of smiling with FDR, with Churchill, with the troops, with everyone, I mean, you see that smile, it just makes you feel better.
You know, if I could just sort of, I grew up in a household where so much of his own legacy was already, I say legacy, I mean the way he was going to be thought of in the history had already been established, or at least it'd be up for debate later in the presidential years. But I could, especially when I wrote this book, I had such a hard time thinking through how a man who had seen some of the darkest things that humanity has ever done to itself, how he could always be so optimistic. And then I started thinking about it, and maybe this is something to help all of us today, no matter who you voted for, what side you're on anything, is that pessimism requires a lot of energy, just as optimism does. But if Ike were alive today, he'd be saying, let's not misappropriate our energy. He was always talking in optimistic ways about the future, even when things looked pretty dark in the late 60s. And I think that's an important thing. I think you do get some of that vibe from this movie, is just a reframing of the opportunity. And we know at the Battle of the Bulge, when his commanders were all, deeply concerned that we were about to get our clocks cleaned by the Germans, he goes in and says, there'll be no long faces in this room. We have an opportunity.
Absolutely. And I'd like to reframe it ever so slightly, and both of you are welcome to put it in the context of your own personal travels, journeys, and experiences. Susan, one place that is depicted in the film is Suffolk House, which was the advance headquarters for SHAEF, located in Portsmouth.
Right.
You've had the chance to visit that location on several occasions. And the iconic feature of it is the large game board, so to speak, the huge map that is inside where these momentous decisions were made. What's it like for you standing in a space like that, reflecting on what happened there all those years ago?
Well, if I could just say briefly, this year, because it was the 80th anniversary, Southwark House invited me to go back there, and I was delighted to see that they also invited the son and the grandsons of three of his commanders. Arthur Tedder's son, Richard, was there, Henry Montgomery, Monty's grandson, and Will Ramsey, who was Bertrand Ramsey's grandson. And there we were, and it was sort of ironic in a way, I guess because I was representing Dwight Eisenhower, that they asked me to do the speaking, which seemed kind of, we had a wonderful time, the four of us together, and everybody had a chance to speak, but I was supposed to make the sort of lead comment. And I said, basically, that it makes great reading to read about all the conflicts everyone had with each other. I mean, there are all kinds of books that emphasize the difficulties and the rest of it, and there were. But I said, our countries had different strategies, different doctrines, different leadership styles. And when you start thinking about that, I said, it was a miracle. Instead of, focusing too long and hard on the things that were unpleasant and tricky, at least the last couple of paragraphs of whatever book needs to say it was a miracle. Yeah. It was a miracle. And, we just had a wonderful time. May I also say, if you ever get to that part of the world, I've never seen it before, but they took us down into the tunnels that were established there to handle the communications coming back from the Normandy coast. People were living down, like the Churchill war rooms, down underground. It's an extraordinary place. Unfortunately, that particular Southwark House and in the interior is not open to the public. But sometimes you can find a way to go with, they allow some groups in episodically. But
sure.
Have you been there, Craig?
I've not. But am I correct that your grandfather, in fact, did not sleep or live in Suffolk House? He had a little trailer out on the back with confined space with a single bed, and next to it a pile of Western novels and an overflowing ashtray, which the image of that, I think, says as much about him.
Shown in the film, too.
Suffolk House was a stately country house. He did. I actually went to the location where the trailer had been located, and it really is a bit of a walk. It's not right there next to Southwark House, and you'll sort of get the impression that it's closer to the house than it is. But he was out there with his aides in the woods, basically, and he didn't like to stay in big villas and things like that.
The British are very funny about such things. They will establish a command headquarters, particularly Ramsey, who was the naval commander, and they would endow it with the name of a ship. It was HMS Suffolk House, and HMS something else, Her Majesty's ship so-and-so. When I taught at the British Naval Academy, I was at HMS Britannia, a brick building on the shore, but Her Majesty's ship nonetheless. So
that's fascinating. Well, I think we're going to see some very interesting scenes. That map is still there. That's the extraordinary thing about it. And there's even a very similar map down in the communications tunnels. Yeah.
Indeed. That's
And
great.
speaking of maps, I have to throw this in as a representative of the Navy, more or less, on this stage, and that is the discovery of the wreckage of the Yorktown and the ability of the divers to get down inside it that was sunk at the Battle of Midway. They found, if you haven't seen it, go online and look it up, an enormous map painted by some very talented sailor of a Mercator projection of the entire globe on the elevator shaft of the airplane elevator from the flight deck down to the hangar deck, showing all of the movements of the Yorktown during the war. And it's amazingly preserved. It looks brand new. So I'll just throw that in.
Fantastic stuff. I saw some of that myself. In keeping in tune with our movie motif this weekend, I often wondered what Eisenhower thought of certain war films, and I know that a lot of the ones that were made later on in the 1960s he spoke not highly of at all. But according to a 1945 advertisement in Movie Star News, Ike was quoted as saying, "Ernie Pyle's Story of G.I. Joe is the greatest war picture I've ever seen." And that's because in many ways, it ripped away this romanticized and propagandized veneer that had proliferated in Hollywood in the years prior to all of that. And a fun side point on that is that movie showed yesterday in the Majestic Theater right here in Gettysburg, and that was the exact same movie playhouse locally where it played in 1945. Its original run. So great stuff that we're recreating here at the Gettysburg Film Festival. But Susan, on a lighter note, what sort of movies did Ike enjoy?
Oh, well, you're going to be surprised by this. Mr. Alpha Male had one that he particularly loved, and it was a story. I'm going to think of the name here in just one second. I saw it so many times with him that I've put it out of my mind a bit. But this is about Angels in the Outfield. This is so you're laughing because you know this movie, right? Yeah. Well, it's a very sentimental story about this very gruff baseball coach, I guess, and this little girl, and this little girl thinks that she sees angels behind some of the players out in the baseball.
The Pirates.
The Pirates.
Yep.
Oh, you know this. Well, I'm not going to be a spoiler on this one either. I'm pretty sure you can get it on Netflix or somewhere else, but it's such a sentimental movie, and we were surprised by that because he had certain movies that he wouldn't watch if he liked Westerns and all this, not because he wasn't extraordinarily well-read. I mean, just look at his library at the farm. It was a form of complete and total relaxation, and that's the way he used it.
And how about Mamie?
Mamie liked all the romance movies, and he, wasn't as interested in those. But he loved kids too. I have to say, he really did. Probably because he grew up with a whole bevy of them in his childhood. But
Sure.
Mamie was the romantic, and they were very funny to watch.
Perfect.
Like that. Yeah.
Oh, I
they were
can
wonderful.
envision that. That's
Yeah,
lovely.
yeah.
That's absolutely lovely. So you stress the importance of being optimistic in dark times.
Yeah.
What is something happening in our world right now that Eisenhower would find optimism in?
Well, I think optimism is a goal you have to work towards. I mean, I think he would say that this is a great country, and we have to try and make it better every day. I remember he used to say to us, be for something. Be for something. Don't be sitting on the sidelines. Okay, maybe we can't control everything in our environment today, but we can control how we talk to other people. We can control whether we do kind things that nobody's expecting. We can do all kinds of things. There's way more in our power than we think.
Smile a lot.
Smile a lot. That's really true.
It worked for Eisenhower in many
didn't it?
instances.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. There's some wise words to be sharing. And along with similar lines of encouragement, I would just like to send out a word of solidarity to our friends and partners in the National Park Service these days. In 1963, Ike noted this: the idea of preserving in a national grouping such spots of scenic beauty and historic memory originated in this country. In Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, other countries have followed our pioneering example and set aside their most magnificent scenic areas and national treasures for the enjoyment of present and future generations. I can't think of anything that better sums up the American ideal than what he said. And I think given that we can recognize that these places deserve to be funded, staffed, and operated so people from all walks of life can enjoy them.
Jared, I would just like to speak for them, if I may, in saying it's not just these magnificent places where families can go together to learn about their history, but I want to give an enormous shout out, especially to the staff who is still working so hard to keep everything we love here in Gettysburg going. And so my hat's off to them, and let's give them a big round of applause.
Amen. So, Susan Eisenhower, Craig Symonds, thank you so much for joining us in this meaningful conversation. Let's give them one more round of applause, if you will.